Nearly every great civilization in history followed the same path to self-destruction. Not through war, not by natural disaster, and not even economic collapse, but through something far more subtle and far more dangerous: the gradual erosion of critical thinking, replaced by the glorification of ignorance and the celebration of stupidity. Now here's the question you should really be asking yourself. What if we're not just observing this happen, we're living through the final phase right now? Picture this. In 2006, the film Idiocracy imagined a future where society had collapsed into utter intellectual decay. Fast forward to today, reality TV stars become heads of state, and scientists are dismissed as out-of-touch elites for suggesting we stop destroying our environment. These aren't just eerie similarities, they're a detailed blueprint, and we're following it step by step. And the most unsettling part? This pattern isn't new. From the Roman Empire to the Maya civilization, from ancient China to the Islamic Golden Age, every highly developed society eventually reached a tipping point where reason became unfashionable, expertise became suspect, and short-term pleasure was chosen over long-term survival. Take a moment and reflect. Rome once boasted the most sophisticated engineering, legal systems, and military organization on the planet. The Maya predicted celestial events with near-modern accuracy. The Islamic Golden Age preserved Aristotle's works and pioneered algebra and advanced medicine, while medieval Europe was busy burning books. These were not primitive cultures. They were centers of innovation and intellect, until they weren't. In 2016, Oxford dictionaries chose post-truth as the word of the year, acknowledging how emotion and belief had begun to outweigh objective fact. Meanwhile, falsehoods on social media spread 6 times faster than truth. We're not slowly approaching a dystopia. We're sprinting toward it, phone in hand, live streaming our intellectual downfall. The signs are everywhere, if you're willing to look. Anti-vaccine movements are reviving diseases we nearly eliminated. Climate change denial endures despite overwhelming scientific consensus. 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are warming the planet, yet public opinion remains fractured. Conspiracies spread faster than truth because they're more emotionally gratifying than complicated facts. We've arrived at a moment where expertise is seen as arrogance, and doing your own research means scrolling TikTok instead of reading peer-reviewed papers. So let me ask you something directly. When was the last time you truly changed your mind on something important? When did you last seek out ideas that challenged what you believe most deeply? If you're finding it hard to answer, then you may already be further down this road than you realize. The first step of civilizational decline always looks the same: a quiet dismantling of critical thought. It starts small, like a hairline fracture in a dam, but left unchecked, it will bring the entire structure down. Socrates saw this danger over 2,000 years ago. He declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. Athens responded by forcing him to drink poison. Why? Because he had the audacity to ask uncomfortable questions. He was executed for challenging complacency. Sound familiar? Today, we don't need poison to silence dissent. We have something more efficient: social media algorithms that serve us only what we already agree with. Did you know that people are 6 times more likely to share fake news than factual reporting, especially when it confirms what they already believe? Take Brexit in 2016. Cambridge Analytica exploited psychological profiling to target voters with tailored messages that tapped directly into their fears and biases. Instead of complex debates about trade and policy, millions made a historic decision based on manipulated Facebook feeds. Even many supporters later admitted they didn't fully understand what they were voting for. This is how critical thinking dies. Not with censorship, but with distraction and manipulation, cleverly disguised as democracy. And it's not the first time. Ancient Rome's early republic thrived on open debate. Citizens gathered in forums to discuss policies. Speeches by thinkers like Cicero were revered for their logic and depth. Leaders were expected to study history, law, and philosophy. But as Rome grew more powerful and decadent, something changed. Poet Juvenal described a society more interested in bread and circuses, free food and public games than in civic responsibility. The people stopped asking tough questions. They traded politics for entertainment. Let me ask you, when was the last time a serious policy discussion went viral online? When did you last see a detailed analysis shared more than a meme? The Roman Forum was once a hub for serious political debate. People gathered to discuss policy and governance. Cicero's speeches were admired not for drama, but for their logical precision. Senators were expected to be well versed in philosophy, law, and history. But as the Roman Empire grew wealthier and more comfortable, something shifted. Poet Juvenal famously coined the phrase bread and circuses, criticizing how Roman citizens had traded civic responsibility for free food and entertainment. Instead of questioning their leaders, people turned their focus to gladiator games. Now ask yourself, when was the last time a real policy debate went viral? When did detailed analysis trend higher than a meme or a soundbite? Today, we're actively dismantling the very institutions designed to teach us how to think. Between 1970 and 2018, the number of college students majoring in the humanities dropped from 17% to just 8%. Philosophy, literally the love of wisdom, is being removed from universities across the Western world. We're cutting the very subjects that teach us how to examine ideas, question assumptions, and think critically. But it's not just education that's in decline. Look at how we consume information. The average person spends less than 15 seconds reading an article before sharing it. We've trained ourselves to react to headlines, not engage with the content. Our attention spans are so short that complex thoughts can't compete with catchy slogans and emotional triggers. Now reflect on your own education. Were you taught how to think? Or what to think? Were you encouraged to question authority or to obey it? The answer might explain more about our current crisis than any headline ever could. Because when critical thinking disappears, it doesn't vanish all at once. It fades gradually, like a forest overtaken by disease. A few trees get sick, then entire sections rot. And before you know it, all that's left is a wasteland, where nothing deep or lasting can grow. The next phase is even more dangerous, because it feels good. The rise of short-term narcissism. This is the stage where civilizations stop thinking about the future, where me right now becomes more important than us tomorrow. Political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville warned about this while analyzing American democracy. He feared that citizens might become so obsessed with personal comfort that they'd lose all interest in long-term planning. He called it soft despotism. Not the brutality of tyranny, but the gentle suffocation of endless entertainment and constant distraction. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche took it even further. He described the rise of the last men, a generation so fixated on safety and comfort that they lose all appetite for greatness, sacrifice, or legacy. He imagined these people blinking in confusion at questions like, what is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Concepts too vast and too uncomfortable for minds trapped in the present moment. Look at the Maya civilization. At their height, the Maya were extraordinary. They built cities that stood for centuries, calculated celestial events with stunning precision, and developed a calendar more accurate than ours. But when their population began to outgrow their environment, they reached a crossroads: adapt for the long term, or maintain comfort in the short term. They chose comfort. Despite mounting evidence of deforestation, soil erosion, and water shortages, Maya rulers kept expanding their cities and enjoying luxury. They had the intellect to predict eclipses hundreds of years in advance, but not the wisdom to apply that thinking to their own ecological emergency. Now look around. We're living through our own Maya moment. Climate change is not a mystery. We have more knowledge about Earth's systems than any civilization in history. We can model climate scenarios decades ahead with impressive precision, and yet our collective response remains stuck in short-term thinking. Quarterly profits, election cycles, instant political wins. Here's the question that cuts right to the core. If you were absolutely certain that your choices today would shape whether your grandchildren could survive on this planet, would you live differently? And if your answer is yes, then ask yourself, why haven't you started already? A 2011 study showed that we're wired to sabotage our own futures. Brain scans revealed that people perceive their future selves almost like strangers, making it much easier to chase TikTok dopamine hits today rather than, say, saving for retirement. This isn't simple stupidity. It's a deep-rooted bias in human psychology. But here's the difference between collapse and survival. Successful civilizations find ways to override these biases through traditions, institutions, and cultural values that prioritize long-term thinking. Wall Street insiders knew those subprime mortgages were a 2008 financial crisis. Internal emails later surfaced. Some literally called them toxic waste. But short-term profits were massive, so the system kept pushing forward. And when everything collapsed, millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. But the executives? They walked away with bonuses and government bailouts. This is short-term narcissism at a civilizational scale, privatizing profit while socializing risk. We've built systems that reward instant gratification and punish foresight. You've felt this too. How many times have you made a choice because it felt good right now, even if it wasn't best for your future self? How often do you pick convenience over sustainability? The behaviors that break civilizations don't always start with malicious intent. They begin with everyday decisions, small, personal, and seemingly harmless, that become disastrous when repeated by millions. Now, we enter the most dangerous stage, the organized rejection of expertise. This is where societies don't just neglect wisdom, they turn against it. Carl Sagan saw this coming. He wrote, "We've arranged a global civilization that profoundly depends on science and technology, yet almost no one understands either. That's a recipe for disaster." Sagan wrote that in 1995, before social media, before internet echo chambers, before the global distrust of scientists and experts we see today. He understood the danger of a civilization dependent on knowledge it doesn't respect, because that gap between dependence and understanding becomes a playground for con artists and power-hungry demagogues. Philosopher Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. She warned that history's greatest horrors weren't always driven by monsters, but by ordinary people who stopped questioning authority, people who didn't consciously choose evil. They just stopped thinking. History offers a clear warning. Look at the Ming Dynasty in China. For centuries, they led the world in maritime exploration and technology. Their treasure fleets reached East Africa decades before European explorers. Chinese innovations were far ahead of their time. But then a shift occurred. New emperors viewed foreign knowledge with fear and suspicion. They saw global trade and innovation as threats to tradition, so they banned overseas travel, burned their fleets, and turned inward. China wasn't conquered from the outside. The Ming dynasty collapsed under the weight of intellectual isolationism. Today, we're repeating the same mistake, just on a global scale. Trust in scientific institutions has been falling fast. In 1973, 87% of Americans trusted scientists to act in the public interest. By 2019, that number had dropped to 57%. Look at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Humanity had its most advanced medical systems in history. Thousands of researchers worked around the clock to fight the virus. But a large part of the population chose to believe influencers on social media over credentialed doctors. People literally died because they trusted Facebook posts over physicians. Medications like ivermectin, a horse dewormer, were taken more seriously than vaccines developed by teams of world-class scientists. This isn't just ignorance anymore. It's an outright attack on expertise itself. Even more disturbing was the backlash to basic public health efforts like mask mandates and social distancing. These weren't complicated medical procedures. They were simple, time-tested public health strategies, the kind used successfully in earlier pandemics. Yet they weren't rejected for scientific reasons. They were rejected because taking expert advice was seen as a threat to personal freedom. We reached a point where wearing a mask or keeping distance became more about political identity than health or science. But take a moment to ask yourself honestly, how many experts do you truly trust? Your doctor? Your mechanic? The weather forecaster? Now ask, why do you trust them, but not climate scientists? What's the difference? Is it really about the quality of the evidence? Or is it about whether their expertise challenges beliefs you're not ready to confront? This is where the pattern gets dangerous. These aren't isolated problems. They form a feedback loop. A cycle where each issue amplifies the others. Psychologists call this a doom loop. When critical thinking deteriorates, people become more vulnerable to short-termism. They can't process complex long-range consequences. When short-term thinking dominates, society loses patience for the slow, careful work that real expertise requires. And when we begin rejecting expertise outright, decision-making breaks down, which only creates more crises, making people more desperate for simple, fast answers. This is the cycle we're trapped in, and climate change is the ultimate test of whether we can escape it. It demands the very things we're collectively abandoning. Critical thinking about complex, interconnected systems, long-term planning, in a culture addicted to comfort, and trust in a scientific consensus. But even here, the feedback loop is accelerating. 2020 study revealed something shocking. Communities hit hardest by climate disasters often become less supportive of climate action afterward. Why? Because when you're facing an immediate crisis, long-term planning feels like a luxury. People want someone to blame, someone to fix it now. And this is how civilizations decline. Not through sudden collapse, but through slow unraveling. Each crisis makes the next harder to fix. The Maya didn't vanish overnight. They lost their ability to coordinate, to plan, to act together. Rome didn't fall in a single moment. It rotted from within, losing the civic virtues that had once made it powerful. So ask yourself, are we the Romans of 400 AD, telling ourselves everything is fine as the foundation crumbles? Or the Maya of 800 AD, so consumed by today's emergencies that we can't see the deeper collapse already in motion. But here's the critical insight. Some civilizations do escape the spiral. Some cultures find renewal. They rediscover critical thinking. They rebuild long-term vision. They reinvest in wisdom. The most famous example? The Renaissance medieval. Europe had descended into a kind of intellectual dark age. Knowledge was confined to religious elites. Critical thinking was suppressed. Most people lived in ignorance. So what changed? Not a single event. Not one leader. It was a cultural pivot. A collective decision to value curiosity, reason, and knowledge again. The rediscovery of ancient texts sparked a new hunger for understanding. Patrons invested in long-term intellectual and artistic projects. The printing press made knowledge widely accessible, while still preserving respect for expertise. But here's what truly made the Renaissance different. It had institutional support for long-term thinking, unlike the Maya who couldn't resist their elite class's short-term appetites. Renaissance Europe built structures, universities, scientific academies, and artistic guilds that rewarded depth, patience, and intellectual honesty. Or look at modern South Korea. In 1960, it was one of the poorest nations on earth. Today, it's a global leader in technology, education, and innovation. How did they do it? Through massive, deliberate investment in education, particularly in critical thinking and reasoning skills. They didn't just teach students what to think, they taught them how to think. Meanwhile, Venezuela, a country with the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, collapsed. Why? Because its leadership chose quick political wins over long-term institutional development. So what's the difference between success and failure? It's not natural resources, it's not luck. It's a conscious choice. To invest in the slow, unglamorous work of long-term civilization building. Choosing long-term thinking over instant gratification is never easy. But it's what defines enduring civilizations. The Venetian Republic offers a powerful example. For over 1,000 years, Venice sustained stable, effective governance by building systems specifically designed to outlast political whims. Their leaders weren't chosen for charisma. They were selected through intricate processes that valued wisdom, competence, and experience. Their economic policies didn't chase quick profit. They balanced short-term needs with long-term sustainability. Venice thrived because it understood something many modern democracies have forgotten. Good governance doesn't happen by accident. It requires deliberate design, systems that check impulsive decisions and safeguard against collective delusion. Reviving a civilization isn't magic. It takes conscious work. It takes people who see the patterns, who understand the risks, and who are willing to build rather than just criticize. So the real question is, are you one of those people? When you look around at today's intellectual disorder, do you feel part of the solution or part of the inertia? Because passive observation is no longer an option. History is clear. Societies are saved by people who act, not by those who just watch. We need clear, practical steps to counter each stage of decay. First, we need to rebuild critical thinking, starting in education. We must teach students how to think, not just what to know. That means training in metacognition, understanding how we form beliefs, how to evaluate sources, and how to spot our own blind spots. Finland's school system is leading the way. It emphasizes analytical skills, not rote memorization. And Finnish students consistently rank among the top in global critical thinking scores. Second, we need institutions that think in decades, not quarters. In Wales, the Well-Being of Future Generations Act requires all government decisions to consider impacts 7 generations into the future. What if corporate leaders were held legally accountable for long-term environmental harm? We'd get different decisions, better decisions. Third, we must rebuild respect for expertise, without abandoning healthy skepticism. That begins with media literacy, teaching people to tell the difference between a credible source and viral misinformation. In your personal life, it means choosing discomfort over certainty. Seek out views that challenge your assumptions. Support journalism that prioritizes truth over outrage. Make choices not just for now, but for the next generation. And most of all, practice intellectual humility. That quiet but powerful discipline of admitting when you're wrong and updating your views based on new evidence. Right now, we're standing at the same crossroads every great civilization eventually faces. We can drift toward slow collapse or we can turn toward renewal. The first path is easier. It asks nothing but your silence. The second path is harder. It demands reflection, discipline, and action. So ask yourself honestly, how often do you share information without checking it? When did you last change your mind, not because of pressure, but because of evidence? How often do you trade truth for comfort? Because this isn't theoretical. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhythm is unmistakable. Civilizations fall when short-term thinking, intellectual decay, and hostility to knowledge take root. But some choose a different path, a path of renewal, of learning, of rebuilding. Rome and the Maya failed to choose, but others, like Renaissance Europe or modern South Korea, did. The question is no longer can we avoid collapse. The question is, will we choose to? Will we be remembered as the generation that broke the spiral, or the one that let it finish? So let me leave you with the only question that really matters now. What will you do differently tomorrow? Not what politicians should do, not what companies should change. You. If this message shifted how you think, there's someone in your life who needs to hear it too. Maybe it's a friend still convinced everything will fix itself. Or a family member who's tuned out of serious ideas. Or a colleague clinging to certainty because the truth feels too complex. Share this with them, not to prove a point, but to invite a conversation. Because real change happens not in echo chambers, but in the space where different perspectives meet, clash, and grow. Remember, the future isn't built by them, it's built by us. By our choices, our actions, our willingness to think, question, and imagine something better. The stakes couldn't be higher. But so is the potential. Every civilizational renewal in history began with people who refused to believe decay was inevitable. People who embraced questions over easy answers. Who saw the future not as a fate but as a responsibility. The conversation about tomorrow starts now, and it starts with you.